George Floyd was a black man. He was a father, a son, a brother, a friend. He was 46 years old when his life was taken away on May 25, 2020. His death was not a quiet one. It happened on a street in Minneapolis, Minnesota. A police officer knelt on his neck for over 9 minutes. Floyd pleaded for his life. He said, "I can't breathe." Those words became a global cry. They echoed the final words of Eric Garner, another black man killed by police years earlier. His death was filmed by bystanders, and the footage spread like wildfire across the internet, showing the world a chilling reality. The video was brutal and undeniable. It showed a man losing his life under the knee of authority. For many, George Floyd became a symbol. He represented generations of black Americans who faced police brutality and systemic racism. His death was not an isolated incident, people said. It was part of a long, painful history. This history was one of injustice and unequal treatment. The raw emotion of that moment cut through political divides, at least for a short time. People who had never thought much about racial injustice started to pay attention. His name became known in households around the globe, a name synonymous with a call for profound change. Why did this particular death spark such a massive reaction? Perhaps it was the clarity of the injustice captured so vividly. Perhaps it was the timing during a pandemic that had already laid bare societal inequalities. Maybe it was the repetition of those haunting words, "I can't breathe," that resonated so deeply. Whatever the exact combination of reasons, George Floyd's final moments forced a conversation. It was a conversation America had avoided for too long. It was about race, about policing, about what justice truly means in a country that promises liberty for all. The world watched, and many joined in asking these difficult questions. The name George Floyd now carries immense weight. It is more than just the name of a man. It is a reminder of a moment when the world seemed to stop and listen. It signifies a period of intense pain, anger, and a desperate hope for meaningful change. People learned about his life, his struggles, and his humanity, making the injustice of his death even more profound. He was a person with dreams and a family, not just a headline. Understanding who he was, a human being, is crucial to understanding why his death mattered so much to so many people across the United States and the entire world, sparking a movement that demanded immediate action. The summer of 2020 was unlike any other in recent memory. Following George Floyd's murder, protests erupted in Minneapolis. They quickly spread to cities and towns all across America. Then, they went global. From London to Sydney, from Paris to Seoul, people marched. They carried signs saying Black Lives Matter. They chanted George Floyd's name. They demanded justice for him and for countless others. These were not just small gatherings. Millions of people took to the streets. It was one of the largest protest movements in United States history, a testament to the depth of feeling his death had stirred. The protests were diverse. People of all races, ages, and backgrounds participated. Many were young, fueled by a desire for a more just future. They faced police in riot gear. Sometimes there were clashes. Tear gas filled the air in some cities. Curfews were imposed. Yet the people kept coming out day after day, week after week. Their message was clear. Enough is enough. The system is broken, they cried, and it needs to be fixed now. The sheer scale of the demonstration showed that this was not a fringe issue. It was a concern that resonated deeply within the heart of society. The phrase, "I can't breathe," became a powerful rallying cry. It was written on masks, on posters, and shouted by protesters. It symbolized the suffocation of black lives under the weight of systemic oppression. The protests were not just about George Floyd. They were about Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and so many others whose names had become hashtags. They were about the daily injustices, big and small, that black people and other marginalized communities faced. This collective outpouring of grief and anger created a sense of urgency, a feeling that real change might finally be possible. This period was often called a racial reckoning. For many white Americans, it was a moment of awakening. They began to learn about concepts like systemic racism and white privilege. Book sales on these topics soared. Difficult conversations happened in homes, workplaces, and schools. Corporations released statements supporting Black Lives Matter. Sports teams knelt in solidarity. There was a feeling, however fleeting, that America was finally ready to confront its troubled racial past and present. The energy was palpable, a powerful wave of collective will demanding that the nation live up to its ideals of equality and justice for every single citizen. In the immediate aftermath of George Floyd's death and the widespread protests, there were tangible signs of change. The officers involved in Floyd's death were fired quickly. Then they were arrested and charged. This swift action was unusual in cases of police violence. Many saw it as a direct result of public pressure. Derek Chauvin, the officer who knelt on Floyd's neck, was eventually convicted of murder. For supporters of racial justice, this conviction felt like a small victory, a rare instance of accountability, though they knew it was just one step on a very long road. Across the country, cities and states began to discuss and implement police reform. Some jurisdictions banned chokeholds and no-knock warrants, the latter being a key factor in Breonna Taylor's killing. There were new calls for de-escalation training and increased use of body cameras. Conversations about reallocating funds from police departments to social services gained traction in many communities under the banner of defund the police. Though this slogan was often controversial and misunderstood, the idea was to invest more in community-led solutions to problems like mental health crises, addiction, and homelessness, rather than relying solely on armed officers. Beyond policy, there was a wave of symbolic change. Statues of Confederate leaders and other controversial historical figures were removed, sometimes by protesters, sometimes by city officials. Streets were renamed. Murals honoring George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement appeared on walls in cities big and small. These artworks became powerful public statements, visual reminders of the ongoing struggle for racial equality. Companies pledged billions of dollars to support racial equity initiatives. Diversity and inclusion programs received renewed attention. There was a widespread acknowledgement, at least on the surface, that things needed to be different. This period, roughly from mid-2020 through 2021, felt like a moment of genuine possibility. The awareness of racial injustice was at an all-time high. There was a sense of momentum. People believed that the sacrifices made by protesters, the pain expressed by communities, and the global attention on America's racial disparities would lead to lasting transformation. New laws were being drafted and conversations were happening at every level of government and society. It seemed as though the needle was finally moving, pushed by an undeniable force of collective will and a shared desire for a more equitable nation for all its inhabitants. However, as time has passed, the initial surge of energy and unity seems to be waning. The year is now 2025. It has been 5 years since George Floyd's death. The intense focus on racial justice that characterized that summer has, for many, receded into the background. Other crises and political battles have captured public attention. The news cycle moves quickly. The sustained pressure that brought about those early changes has become harder to maintain. Some activists express a sense of fatigue, while others point to a deliberate pushback against the progress that was made, creating a more challenging environment. The political climate has become more polarized. Issues of race and policing are often caught in partisan crossfire. The consensus that seemed to emerge in 2020 has fractured. Some of the reforms that were passed have faced challenges or have been diluted. Efforts to pass federal police reform legislation, like the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act, stalled in Congress and have not been revived with the same urgency. This lack of federal action has left many feeling disillusioned, as local and state-level changes can only go so far in addressing a nationwide problem that requires a comprehensive approach. Support for the Black Lives Matter movement, while still significant, has seen a decline in some public opinion polls compared to its peak in 2020. The narratives around protests and racial justice have been actively contested. Some media outlets and political figures have focused on instances of unrest during the 2020 protests, using them to discredit the broader movement for racial equality. This has contributed to a counter-narrative that paints racial justice activism as divisive or even dangerous, making it harder to build broad coalitions for change and sustain the initial momentum that was so powerful. Furthermore, the economic promises made by corporations have come under scrutiny. Reports have shown that many of the pledged funds have been slow to materialize or have been directed in ways that don't always align with the core goals of racial equity advocates. There's a growing concern that some of the initial responses were more performative than substantive. This allyship fatigue or racial justice fatigue is a real phenomenon, as the hard work of dismantling systemic inequities requires long-term commitment, not just temporary gestures. The initial outpouring of support now feels like a distant memory to some, replaced by a more complex and often discouraging reality. One of the most visible signs of this shifting landscape is the fate of the memorials and murals created in honor of George Floyd. In the months and years following his death, these spontaneous and commissioned artworks became sacred spaces. They were places for reflection, mourning, and a continued call to action. Flowers, candles, and notes were often left at these sites. They served as constant public reminders of why the protests happened and what was at stake. These visual tributes were a testament to community grief and resolve, painted onto the very fabric of American cities. However, recently, many of these memorials are disappearing. Some are being officially removed by city governments, citing reasons like public works projects, traffic concerns, or the end of temporary permits. For example, in cities like Minneapolis itself, debates have raged over the preservation of George Floyd Square, the intersection where he was killed. While parts of it remain a community-held space, there have been ongoing pressures and changes. In other cities, murals have been painted over, sometimes quietly, sometimes after contentious public debate. Each removal feels like a small erasure of history, a chipping away at the public memory of that pivotal moment. It's not just official removals. Vandalism has also been a persistent problem. Murals have been defaced with racist graffiti or messages opposing the Black Lives Matter movement. Sculptures and other installations have been damaged or destroyed. These acts of desecration are deeply painful for the communities that created and cherished these memorials. They are seen as direct attacks not just on art, but on the memory of George Floyd and the ongoing struggle for racial justice. Each act of vandalism sends a chilling message that the fight for equality is far from over, and that there are active forces seeking to silence these expressions. Community members and activists are fighting back, trying to protect these spaces and create new ones. They argue that removing these memorials is an attempt to sanitize history and to make people forget the injustices that led to their creation. When they take down a mural, they're trying to tell us to move on. One activist in Philadelphia was quoted as saying in a local news report, "But we can't move on until there's real justice." The struggle over these memorials highlights a broader battle over public memory and the narrative of racial progress in America. It's a fight to keep the story alive and visible. The initial burst of activity around police reform legislation has significantly slowed and in some cases, even reversed. While some cities and states passed meaningful laws in 2020 and 2021, the momentum at the federal level quickly dissipated. The George Floyd Justice in Policing Act, which aimed to address issues like qualified immunity for officers, chokeholds, and racial profiling, failed to pass the United States Senate. This failure was a major blow to activists and reformers who had hoped for comprehensive nationwide changes to policing practices. The lack of bipartisan support really underscored the deep divisions on how to approach public safety and accountability. Since then, efforts to revive federal legislation have been sporadic and honestly, largely unsuccessful. The political will that seemed present in the summer of 2020 has been redirected, or has just diminished. At the state level, the picture is mixed. Some states have continued to pursue reforms, but others have seen rollbacks or have passed laws that actually strengthen police protections or increase penalties for protesters. This patchwork of laws means that accountability and police conduct can vary dramatically depending on where a person lives, undermining the idea of equal justice under the law for all Americans across the nation. Concerns about rising crime rates in some cities have also shifted the political conversation. This has provided an opening for opponents of police reform to argue that changes have gone too far and have made communities less safe. This narrative often overlooks the complex causes of crime and can be used to justify a return to more punitive policing tactics, rather than investing in community-based violence prevention programs or addressing root causes like poverty and lack of opportunity. The tough-on-crime rhetoric has resurfaced, making it more difficult to advocate for reforms focused on accountability and de-escalation, even though such reforms are intended to build trust and improve public safety for everyone. Advocates for reform express deep frustration with this legislative inertia. They point out that the problems that led to George Floyd's death, excessive force, lack of accountability, racial bias, have not disappeared. We marched, we pleaded, we presented solutions, and yet, here we are still fighting for basic changes that should have been made decades ago, a community organizer from Chicago recently stated. The slow pace of legislative change means that the daily experiences of many Black and brown Americans with law enforcement continue to be fraught with fear and injustice, a stark reminder that the promises of 2020 remain largely unfulfilled. On the ground, in communities most affected by police violence and racial injustice, there is a palpable sense of unease. The hope that flickered so brightly in 2020 has been tempered by the realities of the years that followed. Many people feel that the attention of the wider public has moved on, leaving them to continue the struggle with less support and visibility. It felt like the world was with us for a moment, a resident of a predominantly black neighborhood in Atlanta shared. Now it feels like we're shouting into the wind again, and fewer people are listening to our voices. The removal or vandalism of George Floyd memorials is particularly disheartening for these communities. These were not just artworks, they were symbols of shared grief and a collective demand for change. When these symbols are attacked or erased, it feels like a personal affront and a dismissal of their pain. That mural was for my son, so he would know what happened. So he would know people cared, a mother in St. Louis said after a local Floyd tribute was painted over. Taking it down is like saying his future, our future, doesn't matter as much as a clean wall or a new development project. There's also a growing fear that the window for substantial reform is closing or has already closed. Young activists who were energized in 2020 now face the daunting task of sustaining a movement in a less receptive climate. They speak of burnout and the emotional toll of constantly fighting against systemic inertia and outright opposition. We poured our hearts and souls into this, believing this time would be different, a young organizer from Los Angeles expressed. To see things sliding back, or just staying stuck, is incredibly painful, but we can't afford to give up, even when it feels overwhelming. Despite the setbacks, there remains a resilient determination within these communities. Grassroots organizations continue their work, focusing on local initiatives, mutual aid, and political education. They are building power from the ground up, even if the national spotlight has dimmed. They understand that the fight for racial justice is a marathon, not a sprint. The legacy of George Floyd for them is not just about a moment in time, but about a continuous commitment to creating a society where Black lives truly matter, in policy and in practice, every single day, in every corner of the nation. Several factors contribute to the perceived loss of momentum for racial justice since the peak of 2020. One significant element is the natural cycle of public attention. Intense focus on any single issue is difficult to sustain over long periods, especially when new crises emerge. The COVID-19 pandemic continued to evolve, economic concerns mounted, and international conflicts have drawn media and public interest away from domestic social justice issues. This issue fatigue means that the constant, widespread pressure needed for systemic change becomes harder to maintain as time goes on. Another key factor is the organized and often well-funded opposition to the changes proposed in 2020. The calls for police reform and a deeper reckoning with racial history sparked a significant backlash. Conservative political movements and media outlets actively worked to reframe the narrative, portraying protesters as violent extremists and reforms as dangerous to public safety. This counter-movement has been effective in mobilizing its base, influencing political discourse and stalling or even reversing progressive policies. Terms like critical race theory became politicized, used to shut down conversations about systemic racism in schools and public institutions, further dividing the public. The inherent difficulty of dismantling deeply entrenched systemic racism also plays a crucial role. The problems are complex, woven into the fabric of American institutions for centuries. Quick fixes are rare, and lasting change requires sustained effort, political will, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. Many of the initial corporate pledges and political statements, while welcome, did not always translate into the deep, structural transformations that are needed. The shift from awareness to concrete, lasting action is a massive undertaking, and the path is often met with resistance from those who benefit from the status quo or fear change. Finally, the economic anxieties faced by many Americans can also divert attention and resources from social justice causes. When people are struggling with inflation, job insecurity, or housing costs, their immediate priorities may shift. While these economic issues are often intertwined with racial inequality, the connection is not always made clear in public discourse. This can lead to a sense of competition for resources or attention, rather than an understanding that creating a more equitable society benefits everyone. Addressing these interconnected challenges requires a nuanced approach that some find difficult to embrace amidst pressing personal concerns. 5 years after his murder, the legacy of George Floyd stands at a critical juncture. The initial wave of global outrage and demands for change has met the hard realities of political resistance and societal inertia. Memorials are being removed, legislative progress has stalled, and the intense public focus has undoubtedly softened. It would be easy to conclude that the ground gained is now being lost, that the moment of reckoning has passed without yielding the profound transformation many had hoped for. This is a dangerous conclusion to accept without a fight. However, the true legacy of George Floyd is not solely measured by federal laws passed or murals that remain standing. It lives in the heightened awareness that persists, even if it's less visible in mainstream headlines. It lives in the millions of people who were awakened to the realities of systemic racism and who continue to engage in difficult conversations and local actions. It lives in the young activists who found their voice in 2020 and are now the next generation of leaders. The seeds planted during that summer of protest continue to grow, albeit sometimes in less visible, more challenging soil than before. Preserving and advancing George Floyd's legacy requires a renewed commitment. It means actively resisting the erasure of memory, supporting grassroots organizations that continue the fight for justice, and holding elected officials accountable for their promises. It means understanding that the struggle for racial equality is a long-term endeavor, with periods of progress and periods of backlash. The challenge now is to prevent fatigue from turning into apathy, and to find new ways to sustain the energy and focus needed for lasting change in our communities and our institutions. What are your thoughts on George Floyd's legacy today, in 2025? Do you see signs of progress, or are you concerned about losing ground on racial justice? How do you believe we can best honor his memory and continue the work that his death so powerfully reignited? Your experiences, your perspectives, and your voices are crucial to this ongoing conversation. Thank you for reading and for engaging with this important topic. Please share your opinions in the comments below. If you found this analysis insightful, please like this essay and subscribe for more discussions on justice and society. Your engagement helps keep these vital conversations alive.